marginalizations and the crisis of development is in fact intertwined with each other. You find that a large chunk of people today is in fact increasingly getting marginalized. And I would like to focus this whole process of marginalizations in the context of something which I'm a little more familiar, on which I have been thinking and reflecting, in the context of Adivasis in India. Now, we all know that when India began the national reconstruction process in the post-independent era, I think the group or the community which was almost at the margin was nearly, other than the what's called the Dalits, it was the Adivasis. And since last 50 years, so many programs, so many efforts, so many policies, so many legislation has been worked out in order to see that there is a sustained development of the Dalits and Adivasis. Now, if you really look at these developments, what do you really find? There are three very important components. One is that there is always an effort by the state to protect the Adivasis and the Dalits. There have been an effort to mobilize them in terms of reservations. And therefore, you find reservations in the political domain, reservations in employment, reservations in educational institutions. And thirdly, you find that there's always been very sustained effort to bring about a rapid economic development, not only economic development, but also you find the social and educational development of the Dalits and Adivasis. And to that extent, you find that, as I said, legislations, development programs, allocation of resources, all really been done. But what has really happened? I'm not denying the fact that in the last 60 years, there is a tangible group of the Adivasis and Dalits have benefited a lot. And this benefit has come primarily from the facilities of reservations in education institutions, in employment. As a result of which you find that a tiny middle class has grown both within the Adivasis as well as the Dalits. And I think this middle class, in fact, playing a very important role. But as India started embarking on the path of development, the development was never really smooth. In fact, there were within a lot of constraints, there was a discriminations, there was a denial, or it's called passive as well as an active. And as a result of what we really find is that there is increasing mobilizations by the Dalits and Adivasis in order to address their issues. And therefore, you find that since not only in the government, but also in the civil society, there were a lot of opposition, lot of resistance in giving a space to both Dalits and Adivasis in accessing benefits, in accessing development, fruits of development. You find that there was increasing alienations of the Dalits and Adivasis from wider social categories. So you find that people who were a part of the trade union movement, who were part of the working class, who were part of the peasant movement, you find by and large Dalits and Adivasis got alienated from these organizations and increasingly moved to what is known as ethnicization or ethnic politics or the caste politics. So you find that if you really look at today, you find that Adivasis and the tribals have almost moved away from that, and you find that they are organizing themselves primarily along the ethnic lines. But when they were organizing along ethnic lines, they're primarily taking the issues which in fact affects their daily lives very substantially. Now, so you find that in the context of Adivasis, therefore you find that on the one hand, you have all these kinds of development programs. And these development programs to some extent has acted as a safety valve. Now, why is it that despite these development programs, benefits have not really gone very far? Because you find that whereas there is one set of development programs, which is coming in the form of affirmative action program, equally there is another very powerful forms of development, which is what we call the political economy of development. And therefore you find that whereas the larger political economy of development you find, then it depends on infrastructure, it depends on industry, it depends on mineral exploitations, it depends on exploitation of forest. And where do you really find these? You really find in the areas, in the interior of Odisha, interior of Andhra Pradesh, interior of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, or interiors of, let's say, Northeast India. So where do you really, therefore? You find, therefore, that these are very important. Therefore, you find that primarily, if you really look at the crisis of development, then you find there's a contradictions primarily between what you find is the plan allocations or the plan development phases in terms of various plans, and you find the larger political economy of development, where you find the larger political economy of development can take place only at the cost of the tribes or the Dalits who live really on the margins of what we call different states. And therefore you find that I primarily see the crisis of the marginalization is, despite the fact of various kinds of affirmative action program, is to do the fact that the affirmative action programs in fact subordinate to larger what is called program of the national reconstruction process or the larger what is called construction process of the state and the national development. And that's where I see is the major contradictions, and that's why you find that the process of alienations, the process of marginalizations, despite 6 decades of various kinds of programs, have not really worked in the context of, let's say, Dalits, but more importantly, in the context of the Adivasis. Now, so you find that all these national projects, what has really happened to the tribals? Have the benefits of industries or infrastructure has really gone to them? How many of them have really got absorbed into these employments? And therefore, what do you find? If you take state after state in the era of what is called the national, what is called socialist reconstruction of the society, increasingly you find that tribals were increasingly being thrown away from the land, forest, and other kinds of resources. Whereas they constitute only 8% of the populations. As far as the displacement is concerned, they are all 5 or 6 times more than the general populations. So you find that there was, along this process of increasingly losing control over land, forest, other restrictions of access to forest, and so on and so forth. So you find that there is a sort of alienations that has really been going on. And this, in fact, what do you find? That it's, earlier you find that they were on the margin, there's no doubt about it. But the kind of margin which began to take place in the post-independent era, in fact, accelerated the process of marginalization, the kind of underdevelopment which actually took place during the colonial rule. So internal colonialism, the influx of the people from outside into the tribal areas, movement to the tribal areas from their own place to elsewhere, increasing, you cannot think of tribals outside of land, but if you really look at today, you find that the increasing landlessness among the tribal populations. So what do you really find? That there is this process of marginalization which has come out of the larger development project itself. And in the reform phase, you find that this, whereas earlier it was a state which was largely responsible for the kind of development, now you find that with the coming of the private sector, the coming of the corporate world, you find that state, in fact, rather than trying to act as a safety valve, in fact, is in fact facilitating the process of dispossession of the land and other kinds of resources. You find that memoranda after memoranda is being signed in almost all states, where they're trying to take the mines, and therefore what you find that basically in tribal areas, what you find is basically there is a resistance. Everywhere you go, people are resisting, opposing the kind of development projects that have really been going on. And because of the resistance, you find that many of them also are moving to what is known as extremist politics. So what you really find is that this whole effort which has been made in the last 60 years of integrating the people on the margin, what is the kind of integrations? The more you have been able to integrate, the more people have really been have moved, or rather they have become marginalized. And this is the glaring example of what you find in the mainland tribal areas. As I said, Odisha, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, you go anywhere, you find increasing marginalization. And therefore you find, to my mind, it is not the integration which is a solution to the problems. If you really want to say solution to the problems, then it depends on the nature and type of integration that we are talking about. Northeast India is much less integrated with the mainland India. And yet you find that in all indicators of social development, Northeast India does far, far better than the mainland India. And they almost do as good as the larger populations in terms of development indicators. So what really I'm trying to say is that all this idea that you integrate the tribals and there will be automatic development, that's not really the questions. One has to raise the questions, what is the nature and type of integrations that we are talking about, and that is the most crucial problem. And the type of integration that we have really talked about is one where you want to absorb them, you want to conquer them, you want to dispossess them, and therefore this is precisely what has given rise to various kinds of extremist movements, not only in mainland India, but also in the Northeast India. Thank you so much.
I want to reflect on the question of development and marginalization from the perspective of gender. Given my earlier discussions, I do not wish to claim that all women have been marginalized by the development discourse. It may be the case that they have not benefited as much as most categories of men have, but there are certainly women in India who have shared equally in the fruits of development. The glass ceiling remains in place though, even for privileged women. Women have benefited in some ways. For example, female life expectancy is now higher than that of males, with fewer women are dying in childbirth. Among girls, there are large increases in school enrollment, as well as better performance in school. In the work world, women have many more opportunities than they did earlier, and of many more diverse kinds. All these questions and these statistics are debatable, but I think there are certain basic things that people will agree upon, that not everyone is equally marginalized, and some people may benefit while others may won't. Yet, I want to draw attention to one aspect of female marginalization, and that is if one looks at the child sex ratios or the current sex ratio in India. Girls are the ones who have got marginalized, even as improvements take place in most indicators of the economy. So one may well ask the question, why does a developing and prospering India, at least for some people, not want girls, and especially not as daughters? If equal or normal sex ratios are an indicator of gender equality, and the reverse is an index of inequality, then India does not represent a very healthy picture on this front. The number of girls has been declining ever since India started liberalizing and as poverty began to diminish. Since the 1980s, the child sex ratio has declined in every decade, plunging to a new low of 914 girls for every 1,000 boys in the latest census of 2011. Now, scholars like Sen and others have drawn a distinction between economic growth and development, arguing that development did not necessarily follow higher GDPs. So even as we admit the possibility that a country or a state may not grow economically and yet have good development, the rational expectation still remains among most human beings that human development and gender equality will go hand in hand. As we progress, we expect that women also will get a fairer share of the development pie and be treated equally. So it's a rational expectation. Yet we have a very big irrational result here. As growth rates have increased and as literacy and life expectancy has improved, work participation is steady, health indicators are improving, yet the number of girls has been progressively reducing. Some scholars have called it the prosperity effect. The more prosperous, the somewhat better educated, the urban dwellers tend to eliminate daughters more than others. Why this paradox, and how did we arrive there? I would like to point out and discuss the role of population policies in the marginalization of daughters. In China, a country equally afflicted by adverse sex ratios, and in fact worse than ours, the one-child policy is famously believed to have worked against girls. They said you can have only one child, and most Chinese wanted a boy. So their sex ratios plummeted and are worse than that in our country. India, however, has not had a strict population policy. We've advocated a two-child policy, but rarely enforced it or been coercive about it. Yet, we also face a gender imbalance crisis. Why? So while the success of the population policy has led to the intended steep declines in fertility, it has had the unintended effect of turning the scales against daughters. People now want small families, but few or no daughters. A one or two girl family will go out of its way to attain a son. And in our research, we have seen women who have undergone up to 7, 8 abortions in order to get a girl child. So if there is no boy, then people are willing to go to any measures to try and get themselves a son. A 2-son family, however, and sometimes these days even a 1-son family, will immediately stop reproducing and will not make any special efforts to try and have a girl child. So how did this bias become so sharp in recent decades? Because most of you will be familiar with the fact that the north and northwest of India have historically had a poor sex ratio. There have been far fewer girls than boys. And yet this ratio has dropped precipitously in the last 3 decades. So what is the new turn of events? As we improve in other ways, as we get more educated, as we work more, as women work more, do everything that is required of them. Archival research shows that the 2-child population policy acted towards the detriment of girl children. The government wished to reduce population, but did little to protect girls or project gender equality during the process. Now, how does development work together to produce the demand for sons, what I call the demand for sons, and the lack of demand for daughters? So as fertility declined, other factors came into play which worked against the desire for daughters. The 80s were the period, as I mentioned, when poverty reduction finally began. From the Hindu rate of growth, the 3-4%, we began to move at 6, 7, 8, and sometimes 9. And this was the time when liberalization was initiated and when the new technology of ultrasound began to spread widely. By the mid-80s, I think all over the country, ultrasound technology was available and began to be used for the elimination of daughters. So as development proceeded and technologies got more sophisticated, it was girls who were being eliminated in the womb itself. Earlier we had female infanticide. People had to at least wait to see what child would be born before they decided they didn't want it, mostly the girl. But today people don't even have to wait. So people have become scientific and rational in planning their families, or at least they think they are being scientific and rational, and they think the state is telling them to have small families. But nobody asks the question, at whose expense? Meant to detect fetal defects, ultrasound was quickly turned towards the determination of the sex of the fetus, deployed to rapidly diminish the number of girls being born. Perhaps the denial at a chance of birth is a fate worse than marginalization. Perhaps those who are born will not suffer the fate of marginalization. The trend of sex selection, however, emphasizes that daughters are dispensable. So how long can a society dispense with daughter and with what consequences? Does the depletion of daughters vary by social profile is the question that I've been asking. Is it a feature of all sections of Indian society? Are sex ratios poor among all castes, classes and faiths? Data shows that the Hindus, Sikhs and Jains have the worst sex ratios, while Muslims have comparatively better sex ratios across the country. Scheduled tribes have better sex ratios, while scheduled castes which had better sex ratios earlier are increasingly losing that advantage. My research using NSS data shows that it is the emerging or the new middle class that tends to eliminate the daughters the most. I call this class the strategizing class. Having newly joined the middle class, its focus is on consolidating its hold and further improving its prospects. Towards this end, it employs several strategies. First, a family shaping strategy, which aims at controls both the size and gender composition of the family. There is a second strategy which has to do with education. So boys will be invested in much more than girls. Girls will be invested in. And I find this in the IIT, where I have looked at 2 cohorts of classrooms. And in those classes, 35% of the families of boys have no sisters at all. And many more have more brothers than sisters. So you can see that, this group of people is very keen to have only boys, spend all their money on boys, marry their boys for big dowries, hefty dowries, So it's an upward mobility strategy that this class is employing in order to retain its foothold and move further. These families are also ones that want to move out of farming or rural areas in general to non-farm employment and into urban fringes of larger or metropolitan cities. Further, they attempt to gain from daughters by marrying them into peri-urban or urban areas. In such spatially hypergamous marriages, dowry becomes all the more necessary, and this does not help the value of daughters. Women's families may gain from marrying up, but typically women do not benefit much from such hypergamous marriages. Rather, they lose value as they no longer occupy their earlier productive roles and may not have the skills to join the labor force in their new location. They do what status production work or concerted cultivation of children, but are themselves now perceived as burdens on the household. So women's lower value translates into a desire not to have daughters. The period following the 80s saw a huge swelling of this emerging middle class. And I think I have tried to map this data with the NSS, and it is precisely at the time that this class was swelling in India that we have seen the worst decline in the sex ratios. I think now much of that class may hopefully be moving into a better position, and we are already seeing in the sex ratio at birth data, which we have from a sample registration survey, that the sex ratios are beginning to turn around slightly. So I think the class dimension of this behavior is something that sociologists need to research more thoroughly. That, when I talk about marginalization, the sex ratio problem has created what is called a marriage squeeze, that there are very few brides for many communities in Punjab, Haryana, UP, etc. And now they're bringing brides from Tripura, from West Bengal, from Assam, and other parts of the country. These are also marginalized women who have a very tough time adjusting in cross-cultural marriages with couples not sharing language, food, values, etc., etc. But those women have been marginalized in their own states, in their own cultures, and that is something that we need to research, which is what my current research is also on. I don't want to say that, only women are marginalized. I would like to say that there are men also in the low sex ratio states who are ultimately marginalized. They too become victims of patriarchy. They are the ones who will be left bachelors. They are the ones who are the poorer, the uneducated, the employed. So you will begin to see a class stratification between those who can marry and those who can't. To wrap up, so I would like to say that, gender inequality yields its own several kinds of marginalizations, and it is the work of sociology to look around the world why these marginalizations are emerging even as the country is purportedly developing and improving its economic prospects. Thank you very much.